Common fantasy. Black feminist warrior poet Audre Lorde asserts that poetry is not a luxury, but instead gives name to the nameless so it can be thought. For me, in this poetic possibility, the fantastic and the utopian converge. Fantasy becomes a medium through which feminist, anti-capitalist worlds can be revisited, reimagined, and realized. However, I have come to understand as an artista colombiana teaching about race, gender, and the law in the US and in the UK that the fantastic also operates to maintain the status quo. Fantasy is used to preserve white male supremacy and the myth of neoliberal democracy in our patriarchal, statist, capitalistic colonial world. Gumdrops is a serial 1 to 4 panel webcomic that Peter Quach and I have co-created about our lives since 2014. In these Gumdrops, published on Tumblr and Instagram on April 26, 2023, Peter and I refer to historical evidence of the horrors of the British Empire. We expose as fantastical the idea of the Commonwealth of Nations and show just how the Commonwealth's lands and peoples have fared in having anything to do with Britain. I moved to the UK in 2020, and this is our first Gumdrops about my experiences and realizations here. We decided to focus on my recent trip to Scotland with my parents and the actual words used by our tour guide describing the Commonwealth. Peter, a Vietnamese American cartoonist from New York City who has also lived in Britain, suggested that we illustrate this tour moment along with 4 images from the colonial archive. This made sense to me as a lawyer trained to believe in the power of the forensic, taught to point to the evidence when attesting to anything, including the genocidal nature of the British colonial project. Learning with and from my students about colonialism and coloniality, i.e., the power structures that remain in place after the end of formal colonialism, has revealed to me the fantastical notion of mutual benefit implicit in the idea of empire and its successor, Commonwealth. A fantasy ground into the minds of white Europeans and new colonial subjects alike in the UK through schooling and mainstream media. These Gumdrops responds to that fantasy. A juxtaposition of the myth of a benevolent British Empire with a photo, 2 historical paintings, and an illustration that separately and together reveal the brutal consequences of having anything to do with Britain. A differentiated yet systemically executed project of slavery, dispossession, policing, and genocide across the globe. From this perspective, Gumdrops offers the forensic and the fantastic as oppositional. The former dispels the latter. Yet, this opposition is not always or necessarily the case. Lorde famously tells us that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And, indeed, the fantasies of benevolent colonialism and neoliberal economics have been legitimized and upheld throughout modern history using a manifold of scientific and forensic methods. We need to create our own alignments of the forensic and the fantastic. Thus, circling back to the utopian fantastic as a poetic gateway into the co-creation of worlds otherwise, I believe that we must look outside the limits of our narrow Western modes of knowledge production if we are to search for visions of the anti colonial worlds Lord foretold.